Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Prime Use series of interviews with top business and technology experts. Today, I'm delighted and honored to welcome a very special guest, Saleem Siddiqui, who is a keynote speaker. He is principal architect, also author of recent learning test-driven development book. So Saleem, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Saleem, I'd like to start off our conversation with your career path. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and about your career trajectory that have led you to your current position.
Gosh, so without taking up the rest of our interview time in that, because the career trajectory has been long and also meandering, I'm a software engineer by trade. And I would say that that has been professionally, and if I may say that intellectually, my greatest passion throughout my life. I was lucky enough to have a very supportive older sister who bought me my first computer when I was in my preteen years. I wasn't even a teenager, and I learned to program there, and I just caught on. It was just a thing that I knew I wanted to do. Of course, at that age, I didn't know that I could make a career out of it, but as I worked through my educational, that part of my life, my education, both my bachelor's and master's, were in computer science and computer engineering. And then I guess I more or less stumbled or tumbled forward in that, more accident than planning, I will admit. And then I got into consulting as my first job. And I've been in software consulting for the vast majority of my professional career. Which means that I work with companies on fairly short-term basis, essentially measured in months. The longest tenures that I've had have been a couple of years. So I guess in a 24, 25-year career, my longest association with one company has been 2 years. What that allows me to do is to constantly learn, constantly challenge myself, constantly improve myself and the teams that I'm a part of, which I think has been, frankly, the greatest privilege that I have enjoyed in my career. So that's a summary of how I've kind of structured, willingly or accidentally, the progression of my career.
I got this. It's very interesting that you're actually, your path, professional path, has been inspired or triggered by your sister, which probably also unconsciously, she bought a computer and it's something that you caught on, as you said. Right.
Very much so. I would say it probably was subconscious when I was younger, and I guess not aware enough of the influence that a lot of inspiring women, both those who are related to me and my mother and my sister and now my wife and even my daughter, but also women in my career who have inspired me to essentially make progress and deal with the challenges that inevitably come with a long career, or in any discipline. Certainly software engineering is not atypical in that sense. So now it is a very conscious part of what I live for, is advocacy, primarily of women and what are called marginalized minorities in software engineering. That's outside of course, delivering quality software for my client. That is an equally important part of what I live for and strive to improve.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's like paying back, right? You got inspired because, I've noticed while doing the research of your profile, I could see that you are actually very active in advocating for women and those marginalized, right? In LinkedIn, on Twitter. So you've been very active doing so. So very interesting.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it's more paying forward, because one can never pay back the people who, as they say, the people on whose shoulders you stand or who support you. They move on. And I think, in my experience, the most noble amongst them don't even want to be paid back, right? The whole, and I suppose that's how societies are formed. You pay it forward for the people who are in need of your support. But I hope that you're right. And thank you for saying that. I mean, I certainly try to do that intentionally these days.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I read your blog where you said about 8th of March, right? That there is that increase in searching. When is the International Men's Day, right? This is something that men are looking on Google, searching on Google, right? So yeah, that is very interesting. What is your perspective? What can be actually done, right, in technology specifically in that industry, right, to promote
Yeah,
more
it's
women.
interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you can continue, please.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Dana. Obviously, we just had International Women's Day earlier this week, and I don't know. I mean, it's frankly a bit embarrassing and saddening to find out that when you have things like International Women's Day or Professional Women's Day, the searches for where's the equivalent for the Men's Day equivalent of this increase, which is almost comical. It would be comical if it wasn't a strong indicator of the pervasive nature of bias in our industry and society at large, right? So yes, what can we do? To your question, I think raising awareness is the minimal that we can do. I think making sure that in the spheres of influence in which we all move around, right? Whether that's large or small, we may only have influence over a few people at work or maybe even a professional setting that we are a part of, a meetup or something like that. Or perhaps we have larger influence if you are in an organization where a lot of people look up to you, perhaps even report to you. Starting there and in the spheres of influence that you have, raising awareness through both education and compassion. I think merely being aware of statistics, we can all quote statistics about, for example, in my industry, the abysmal rate of women in senior positions, especially women of color, non-binary folks. We can all gather the statistics. They're out there. I mean, it's hardly possible to go through a day without stumbling over another dismal or abysmal statistic. But beyond all of this data that we have at our disposal, certainly in my discipline, data is king, right? We all swim in data all day long. I think what we need to do, ask ourselves and ask again within our spheres of influence is, what can we do with this data? I think it's possible to get too dispassionate and too mechanistic when you're frankly swimming, if not drowning in data. So one thing to do is to ask, so what are we going to do about it? And as I like to think, and I hope it's an original thought, but I can't claim that it is we all have privilege of some kind. So it is immaterial to ask, frankly, it is always somewhat useless, if not actually detrimental, to compare different people's privilege. How much privilege do I have versus you or versus anybody else? Those debates never get anywhere. They always generate more heat than light. The proper thing to ask is, what are you going to do with your privilege? What am I going to do with my privilege? So if I'm in a position where, frankly, as a cis male in the software industry, knowing that I get this unearned privilege, perhaps even undeserved, and certainly not solicited, I didn't ask for it, but I have it. So what am I going to do with it? So what I choose to do with it is to utilize it almost, if it's a capital, if I think of it using momentarily capitalistic terms, if it's a capital that I've built up of influence, of authority, of people listening to me, I'm going to use it for the betterment and improvement of marginalized groups and groups of people who frankly don't have that privilege. So that's how I like to phrase it in a nutshell, is instead of getting into conversations about who has more privilege and who has less, everybody should ask themselves, what am I going to do with my privilege?
Okay, I really like this. I really like how you can leverage your privilege and become a voice of those, less privileged. And also the point where you made that we can have, a certain limited amount of impact, right? So there is a small group that we can change. And that actually, brought just recently, as you said, we had this International Women's Day, and I had conversation with my son. He's 9 years old, and we were talking about the International Women's Day, and he's opposing, I don't why there is such a day, right? So, and there is also, teaching, as you say, paying forward, right? This is around you, explaining that it's not against men, right? Sure. So yeah, so I really love that.
I'm kind of curious, Dana, how did you answer that question? I'm really happy that you had that conversation with your son. How did you answer his curiosity?
Yeah, so he said, we were talking about, once I've been in Ottawa, and there is a monument for women, that we're fighting to recognize that women are persons, right? That we have the right to vote and other things. And he said, it's something that happened in the past. Why do we have to celebrate it now? So we are Ukrainians, and we celebrate our Independence Day on 24th of August. You know that there's war right now in Ukraine. So I told him, why do we celebrate something that happened in the past right now, right? So we got independence from Soviet Union in the past, but we want to keep that memory, not to become, like dependent, right? Not to become part of Soviet Union, of Russia, just to keep that memory. The same is happening for women. We remember that we have this International Women's Day, not to, to remember that there were times that there was unjust, like policies. Women were prohibited from taking some jobs, right, positions in the society. It's not that we want to, tell men that men are bad now every day, but it's something that happened and it's worth remembering. Yeah, so that was
Thanks for sharing that. Thanks for sharing that, Dana. And certainly our thoughts are with everybody in Ukraine right now as the situation unfolds. And we are all, unfortunately, most of us are mere observers, but certainly in terms of advocacy, that is certainly another thing. And it can be a dicey thing to even talk about what ends up being global politics or even local politics, but we're all affected by it, right? I mean, we're all affected at a personal level. And to me, the whole notion of bring your whole self to work, like that mantra is hollow unless we include all of the things that you alluded to. And the part about history that you mentioned is, you're right on point. The point about remembering history and historical context, whether that is political oppression that you spoke of, or gender-based oppression, or any others. I mean, take your pick. Sadly, history is rich with all kinds of oppression in the past and in the present. The reason we connect it to the past is not because we want to blame anybody for their heritage or even for their privilege. It is, we want to remind people about the continuity of frankly, culture, right? I mean, so for example, at least in the context of the United States, when we talk about racism and the necessity for anti-racism, it is not to blame people of any one ethnicity. It is to talk about the current and ongoing impact that past policies, as you said, have had on frankly, the people around us and our colleagues, and how we can do what we can do to improve that. So that's a really great point that you made. And I'm happy for you that you made it with your son, but those kind of connections with the past are exactly what we need to make. And they can be really small. In software, for example, the historical exclusion of women. Women used to be, it's funny, women used to be the majority of programmers. And I mentioned that in my book. The first programmers were women. And so when you think about it, now that we have, frankly, despite everything, women are a minority, you ask yourself, like, what happened in the 50s and 60s? Women were programmers and now they are not. Well, software engineering became popular and frankly lucrative. So when it became lucrative, when it became a really profitable, the geeks won, so to say, women were systematically excluded, and minorities, of course. So you have to remember that part of history in whatever sphere you're in, if you are intending to improve things. I think we cannot divorce ourselves from history. We'll be ill-served if we say, oh, well, that happened in the past. What does that have to do with today?
Yeah, totally agree with you. And you know that, well, I never thought, like I knew that there were some prominent women in tech, in programming in the past. I didn't know that they were the majority. Mm-hmm. And your example, and that like just reminded me of another like analogy, that women, there are less women in like chefs, in restaurants, but right. Like every woman cooks at home. So when it's exactly. Like when it's free. So cooking for free, it's for women, yep. Right? But when it's for, like prestige and making money, then we see a lot of men. Not everyone. I believe that the situation is changing as well as in technology, but that that's really.
Yeah, that's a great point you make, and absolutely, you're spot on. I mean, if you think about professions, and it gets delicate, so I hope we're educating our listeners and not offending them. But if you look at all professions, you mentioned chefs and cooking. I mean, cooking is historically, even you could say, yeah. Going back eons in prehistory, an activity associated with the women, but most professional chefs, certainly the famous ones, are men. So you have to ask, why is that? And of course, you gave the answer. When it gets prestigious, when it becomes lucrative, women are sidelined. Same thing happens in music. It's a very funny, I use the word funny with caution. It's not funny in a way that we should laugh about it, but it is certainly odd. In music, it turned out, and it's an interesting history that I would encourage our listeners to kind of look up and learn more about on their own. There were all of these theories that were made about how women couldn't play certain instruments in orchestra. like they didn't have lung power to play the saxophone or whatever. People came up with all kinds of pseudoscience, and therefore they would exclude women from key positions in the orchestra. And it turned out it was just bias. So now most orchestras, I believe it might even be by law enforced in many jurisdictions, you have a curtain. So when you're auditioning to play music, the people who are judging can't see the person who's performing. You only hear the music. And it turned out as when they instituted that policy, all of a sudden, magically, more women were certainly qualified suddenly to become musicians. And so all of that pseudoscience, all of that contrived and built up body of quote unquote knowledge, I mean, really bias, dressed as knowledge, just fell apart. And you knew that it wasn't about lung capacity, or it wasn't about musculature, it wasn't about any of those things. It was frankly male bias masquerading itself in a very naked form. I wish we could do that in software. I'm really somewhat envious of my friends in the music trade who can, if you're, I guess it's less so for vocalists, right? You can probably get somebody's presentation of their gender by their voice, but you certainly can for if they're playing a musical instrument, you can't tell their gender or anything, which is great. So if you're hiring somebody, you don't have to know anything about them. All you need to know about, can they play this musical instrument? Sometimes I wish we could do that with software. Unfortunately, we can't. We can do it to a bit. So when we have coding submissions and we interview people, certainly I try, and in the spheres of influence I ask for them to be blind interviews. Like if I'm analyzing somebody's code, I don't need to know anything about them. Just show me their code. I'm analyzing their code. It doesn't really matter their demographics, right? Unfortunately, you can't take it ultimately because you have to have a face-to-face interview. So there, what you have to do is to be conscious of your own biases and learn to minimize them, and recognize that you're reacting. When you're reacting to a person, you're reacting from a brain that frankly evolved in the savannah to basically exclude the other groups, right? So we are very much biased towards our in groups and biased against our out groups, whatever those are. But recognition of that is the first step. Recognizing our savannah brain, which is frankly, it hasn't evolved in the last 30,000 years, is the first step towards removing all of these biases from hiring, from promotion, from all of these very corporate things that we deal with on a daily basis. You have to recognize first and foremost your own biases and work to counter them from an intellectual standpoint.
I also noticed that you are like passionate coach, right, of agile methodology, right? And I believe that actually this coaching that brings a big value to software developers, right? Maybe you could talk a little bit more about why coaching and how can engineers benefit from these sessions.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think the ability to influence and uplift the careers of others is the greatest privilege one can have. As they say, age is a terrible price to pay for experience. I agree with that. But when you have it, the best thing you can do with that is to uplift the career of others. And of course, one very effective way to do that is to coach others. So I think it's not everybody would have the proclivity or the temperament to be a coach. So I certainly don't want to imply everybody should, as their career progresses, become a coach, but certainly everybody can find opportunities to influence, benefit, and uplift the careers of others. A more formalized version of that is coaching. So I have chosen to, and I've been privileged to have been coached by and still seek out coaches. So I certainly, in the spirit of what we talked about earlier, paid forward to others. I think there are different things that I do. So in a nutshell, there is coaching that is very much in the software space of things. So for example, there are agile practices, as you mentioned, test-driven, agile and extreme programming, XP practices, test-driven development, pair programming, continuous integration, continuous delivery. All of them are well understood, kind of valued practices that junior developers, or sometimes even senior developers, need help on. So I try to pitch in where I can and demonstrate by doing, and also by coaching and teaching. Most of it happens in situ, in place. So in the context of teams that I work with, I offer that advice and certainly work with the people that I work with. Another aspect of coaching is certainly helping people find their strengths. And they could be very different from one's own, right? So that's a coach's job, is to uplift others, not necessarily mold others in one's own form. And that can also bring a lot of value. And in that, I found as my career has progressed, I find that having coaches from certainly different, even different professions, and also from different generations, without kind of getting too caught up in ageism, I find a lot of coaching that I need at this point is from people who started their careers after I did, because they have a perspective that I don't have. And I value that and I benefit from that. And I would say to people who have careers in the latter half of their careers, as I am, to seek out coaches who are frankly younger than them, or certainly, to put it maybe perhaps less bluntly, whose careers are younger than theirs, have started later than them, because they can give you a perspective, having gone through those initial hardening phases of establishing oneself in one career more recently. So of course, we tend to forget things that happened earlier on in our careers. And even if you remember them, of course, their relevance degrades over time. Somebody who has taken up programming in the age of mobile apps in the last 10 years, frankly, has a very different, and I would say for me, a much more relevant experience than I, who frankly took up programming in the 80s. So I would say it's a mutually collaborative exercise or discipline. We can all coach, we all have it in us. We don't have to all become professional coaches, but all of us, certainly as our careers progress forward, have lessons in us that can benefit others, and we should seek opportunities to do that.
Got this. Recently I was watching video from Seth Godin, and he was talking about coaching, and he said that it's like part of current culture, modern culture. Everybody's looking for mentors and coaches, but that notion is not scalable, right? So there can be like you yourself, Saleem, how many people you can coach, right? So what would be the alternative is finding someone you admire, right? And those people might not need to know that. For example, I would admire someone in my industry and they don't have to even know that I exist, but I would, strive to succeed, right? To follow their steps in their career and other things. What would be your take on that? Do you think that that is something that has right to exist?
Yeah, I mean, of course, certainly all perspectives should be allowed. That's an interesting perspective. I think that puts the onus, when the way I interpret, as you said, Seth Godin's statement is, if you are in a position of authority, watch what you do, because you could be influencing, inspiring in positive or less positive ways people whom you do not know. And that has, obviously, that's a very sobering thought, that if you have, especially in the age of social media, everybody has followers, right? Pick your social media platform. You and I met on LinkedIn. I mean, Twitter is also very popular, and you can pick any platform in the software realm. People follow each other's software projects on code repositories like GitHub and elsewhere. And so you can have a sphere of influence, which includes people that you, as you said, you will never meet. So it's a very sobering responsibility that to people who have followings to frankly be good role models. I think that's if that makes people pause and gives them kind of a deer in headlights thing, I think that's a good thing, because in the very highly connected society that we have made, which is largely good, I think we should be thankful, and certainly I'm very thankful that my fellow technologists have at least facilitated a society that is highly connected. It also comes with a huge amount of responsibility. It's not the Middle Ages, or it's not the age of Socrates, right, where Socrates is going around in the ancient Greek taverns and whatever, and he's got 5 followers and he knows who he's influencing, right? It's not like that. Now we are influencing people we will never meet, and so the responsibility is higher. So I take what you're saying in that vein, that the onus is upon people who legitimately or deliberately cultivate large followings on social media platforms or elsewhere, to be very mindful of the influence they have on their followers.
Yeah, totally. And also you mentioned, you've already touched a little bit, Saleem, on your previous career, that like you took on coding, right, and work in the industry in 80s, right, and that like culture and perspective and could differ from those who have taken them in in 19th or later. So maybe you could also give us, I would be keen to know your perspective, how this, culture and also, mindset of engineers, from your perspective, have changed in IT?
Yeah, just a slight correction. I started coding in the 80s. I started my career in the 90s. So
okay.
I'm happy to be as old as I am, but I don't want to appear to be older than I am. But I'm sorry, I forgot your question.
Yeah, so if you could compare, maybe you could give us an overview of your feeling, right? Of how has the culture and mindset changed, right? From where you started your career and comparing to what is now.
Yeah, it's interesting. The word culture obviously is one of those expansive words that takes on whatever meaning the speaker says, right? It can also get stretched beyond its bounds to essentially mean anything that people mean. I define culture perhaps with a small c, so not talking about global culture or anything, any notions such as Western culture, Eastern culture, without getting into that. The organizational culture, if you limit it in professional settings to organizations and the culture of organizations, something we deal with on a daily basis, right? I define that somewhat mathematically, and I've done that in talks. It is the sum total of things that we do, things that we support, and things that we tolerate. So if you just do an inventory, right? It might take you some time. It might take any one of us some time. If you sit down and say, today I did these 5 things, or over the course of the last year, I've done these 20 things, and I've supported these 40 things, and I've tolerated these 100 other things. And if we all put that list together, that's our culture. To me, that is it. It is not some highfalutin thing where we infuse it with meanings and kind of our own biases and philosophical ramblings. I define culture really as a sum of actions, the things that you do, things that you support, and the things that you tolerate. So if we accept this definition, at least momentarily, of course, people can take me to charge for that definition, but I find it a good working definition of culture. If we do that, then you have to then peel back a layer and say, what are the things that we do support or tolerate that have changed over time, to your question. And once I analyze it like that, I would say there are certain things, one could say perhaps several things that we used to tolerate that we no longer do. I mean, of course, we have talked about it already, but I hope we haven't talked about it ad nauseum. The abysmal record of according respect and equivocal salaries, equitable salaries, and hiring and all of that for women and marginalized groups is something we used to tolerate, and inequities in there. I think we're less tolerant of that, which is great. We don't tolerate intolerance, right? So when there's discrepancies in wages, we out them. I was just on International Women's Day, I was amusingly following that Twitter thread about the wage pay gap bot. I think it basically said if any organization tweets about International Women's Day, that bot will tweet their wage disparity, which I think is a very good tit for tat thing. If you're going to put words on Twitter, we're going to put actions on Twitter, which we're going to say, well, you have this wage disparity in organization. So we don't tolerate that, right? Or we are less amenable to being told, oh, we'll address that later, right? So that's a good thing. I think the bright light, shining light, and I would say, of course, social media allows us to do that, that has been shown on these issues of inequity is a great thing. That's a part of culture, so that has changed. There are certain things that, if I just scale it further down, especially in software, there's certain things that I'm ambivalent about, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I can't really put a value judgment on it. Perhaps I have an inkling of that's not so much of a good thing. For example, the popularization of Agile as a mainstream word, as a mainstream commodity. It's been, frankly, both a boon and a curse. It's been a boon so that everybody knows about it. The Agile Manifesto was written almost exactly 21 years ago in February of 2001. That is now so popular that you, in any software discussion, you can take it for granted. Everybody knows what that is and what you're talking about. So that's a good thing. We have a common vocabulary. The curse part of it has been commoditized, and now you have aspects of agility or pseudo agility that have nothing to do with the original collaborative, cooperative model that was envisioned. Very, very much working software centric. It has become essentially a command and control tool. So that's been a curse. So if I think about actions in that sphere, there have been some actions that we do or certainly support now that we wouldn't have 20 years ago. So it's been a mixed bag. I would say mostly I'm optimistic. I think the value of this society that we have with immediate feedback, immediate connections, remote connections, this larger web of influence that we have built is certainly a good thing. I mean, not to go further, you and I wouldn't have met 15 years ago, right? We wouldn't be having this conversation. So this is a good thing. And we enrich our experiences, we build on each other's experiences. So that's been a change in the culture, with obviously society, technology has undergirded society and provided the substrata on which we have built this. So that's been a positive change in culture.
Yeah, totally. And there is the thing about not tolerating intolerance, right? And also many things that we used to tolerate in the past, we would not tolerate right now. And also in your blog, I've been reading it for some time, and there was about this, language, right? About code monkey and other things, like we could have this concept of master and slave, in development. So there is also the big change and shift happening where people realize that this kind of language can impose, is coming from history background and can have some negative impact.
Yeah, thanks for reading and bringing that up. That is important to me. And sometimes people get turned off by that and say, well, these are just words. And obviously GitHub, for example, changed their nomenclature. They used to call in software and version control, people write code and then they merge it to a central place in the repository, a canonical place, which is the single source of truth. It's been called root. It's been called that single source of truth has had multiple names. It's sometimes called root. It's now called main, but it used to be called master. That was the canonical name. And there were also master-slave architectures. And I certainly grew up using that terminology, probably even wrote about it in my ignorant days, or my more ignorant days, I should say. But it's sobering, and it's definitely part of our collective growth, for which we are individually responsible. Nobody's responsible for our growth. Each person takes responsibility for their own growth. It is part of that to recognize, frankly, the offensive nature of these terms. There's no other way to put them, and to excise them. And in software, in software of all places where things are absolutely made up, right? Software is the most malleable thing. It is, if you imagine, if you make an automobile or something and you stamp a name on it that is offensive, then it might be hard, and you sell 10,000 of that, right? Let's say there's a car with an offensive name and it's sold. Well, it's hard for the manufacturer to go out and take that offensive name off the hoods of the cars. But in software, it is very easy. It's bits and bytes. We can change it. When we become educated, when we become contextually, socially, culturally, historically aware, I think the responsibility is immediate to fix it. I think we have very little reason and justification to dally along and to kind of drag our feet. So once you learn, you have to change your behavior and the behavior of the organizations, again, communities that you're a part of, certainly as a software person. So I'm happy to advocate for that. I think language is important. I mean, there's a whole discipline in software it's called domain-driven design, that the whole purpose of that, or a large part of that, is use language from your domain. So if you are if you're building a tax system, then use words from the tax system. Don't use terminology from accounting. If you are building a payroll system, then don't use terminology from a legal system. Use the terminology of the system you're building. Well, we live in a society, and when society recognizes certain terms to be frankly offensive, then we as software people have no business using that terms and simply relying on it as, oh, it's just a word.
The definition, how you define yourself, I believe in your blog or in LinkedIn, you define yourself as egalitarian, right? So it clicked to me, it's probably French word. I had to Google just to make sure that I understand correctly what is that about. And so believing that we are all people, right? So you definitely have this passion for inclusivity, right? Not tolerating intolerance and other things. So tell me about where this concept and belief of egalitarian belief come from.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think it comes from a realization that I'm really passionate about software, and software of all things, right, has absolutely no excuse in being exclusivist. I mean, if you think about, and I say that in the preface of my book, really to become a software engineer, the only thing you need is a brain. That's literally the only thing you need. Any other thing, physical disability, your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your nationality, or anything, none of that matters. I mean, you could, as I'm now learning about this, my friends who are in sports, and learning how bias there is even unjustified. I mean, of course, people say that why can't we have mixed gender sport teams? And they say, well, the musculature of athletes is varied by gender, and some of that is kind of played out, as I'm sure you're aware, in the sports arena, what to do with trans athletes, should they be allowed to operate? As I'm learning through that, I recognize the complexities there, and I support inclusivity there as well to the extent I can. I'm not an athlete, but I support inclusivity everywhere. But in my discipline, we don't even have the thinnest excuse. Like, what are we basing any biases on when we all recognize software as a discipline is an intellectual exercise of the mind? Once you accept that, then the only thing that remains is anything else is a bias, and we should remove that. If you need assistive technologies to type, it should be made available. If you can't browse a web page because it's written poorly and the alt text isn't there, well, that's the flaw of the web page. That's not the person's fault who's blind and trying to read a web page or gain information from that. Everything that in software that you look at that is inaccessible is because of flawed software. Every single thing, without exception. We can't even fall back on, well, historically this and collectively that. Like, we have nothing. We have created our history in the last 70 to 80 years. We are a very modern discipline. We are an absolute intellectual exercise. So that's where it is rooted in my kind of, I would say, staunch and unwavering advocacy for absolute inclusivity in software, because I think the alternative is pure bias, is pure some kind of ism masquerading as some kind of science. So if your software is exclusive, it's not inclusive, it's the fault of the software. You cannot say that, oh, well, I wasn't targeting blind people, or I wasn't targeting this demographic. You just didn't write good software. That's what it boils down to.
Yeah, I really like this. So, and you mentioned, you already touched on that was part that also you mentioned that in the preface to your book. And I would like you tell us more about your book, right? It's called Learning Test-Driven Development. And it has, so I believe many of our listeners are familiar with the technique, right? Mm-hmm. But in your preface, you also say that this technique has not become a standard for coding, right? Mm-hmm. And despite all the benefits, right? So maybe you could tell us what are the benefits for those who are not familiar with, and what actually keeps this technique from becoming a standard for coding?
Yeah, great question, thanks. So we'll try to do justice to that in the little time that we have. What are the benefits of test-driven development? I would say, I guess somewhat self-servingly, it's described in the book, so I would encourage your readers to read there. But in brief, part of the challenge in software, because it's so malleable, right? You can write literally any code that you want, is to stay focused and to solve the business problem at hand with the least amount of software that's possible. And that is important. And that's all right there in the Agile Manifesto. Simplicity in the Agile Manifesto is defined the art of maximizing the amount of work not done. It's worth a pause. Simplicity is defined as the art of maximizing the amount of work not done. So not doing extra work is a huge virtue. Well, how do I know what's extra work? And a very good scaffolding, a very good way to put kind of guardrails around you is to write a failing test first, and then write just enough code that test passes. If you write just enough code to pass that test, you clearly wouldn't have written superfluous code. That's what makes, in a very brief, nutshell way, test-driven development very effective. It is a means to an end, and I do address that near the end of the book in the last chapter. Again, it's not a religious thing for me certainly, and even for the proponents of that. It is a means to an end, but it's a very effective means, so we should not abandon it. If we find a better means to that end, we will certainly adopt it. Thus far, we have not. Test-driven development over the decades, frankly, as Ken Beck has said, he doesn't call himself the inventor. He wrote the original book, which inspired me. He calls himself the rediscoverer, and it has roots going back all the way to the 50s and the cathode ray tube computers. But the reason it was forgotten, and that gets to your second question, is there's this false notion, and that ties back to some of the curses of agility. It is sometimes thought of as a waste of time. So when you write failing tests first, they're failing at that point, right? So you write a test, it's failing. It's literally visually read. And that is somehow seen, and I'm sorry to say, by sometimes people who have more of a managerial bent as opposed to a software engineering bent, as a waste of time. Like, why are you writing a failing test first? It is failing, it's not providing any value, it's broken, it's red, it doesn't work. What's the point? And they missed the larger picture is that failing test is the thing that will keep us on track. The analogy I use for people, and I'm going to try it out on you, so I hope you don't mind. Why do cars have brakes? What would you answer, Dana? Why do cars have brakes?
Why do cars have brakes? To make sure that we don't kill ourselves while driving.
You're way too smart. Most people, yes, you're right. Most people would say to stop, but that's not the reason. And so then the next question is that I ask is, imagine if you were driving a car without brakes, how would you drive it? And most people think very, very slowly. Like I would drive it just as slow so I could open the door and hang my foot out and use the friction of my foot to stop it. That's how you would probably drive a car at 2 miles an hour. So cars have brakes exactly for the reason. So you don't get into accidents. You can drive fast, safely, because you know you can press on the brake to stop when you need to. The same is true for test-driven development. We write the failing test, it's like a brake, because once we have that test green, we can go as fast as we want. So it does speed up, but if somebody is myopic, and if you're in a car with somebody and you brake because you're at a red light and you're saying, you're slowing us down, I wish you didn't brake, they're obviously being myopic. You're slowing down to be safe. You will speed up as soon as the light turns green. So you take the big picture view when you're driving a car, but sometimes, sadly, or I should say many times, hopefully not often enough, but way too often, in my opinion, people take the myopic perspective and saying this whole business of writing failing tests first is just slowing us down. And they fail to see the longer picture of these are the brakes we're building so that we can go as fast as we safely can when we need to. That's the slightly longer explanation of why it hasn't become as popular as it should be.
Yeah, so that's a great explanation. And that analogy that you have provided, that's really like easier to understand the concept and the technique. So thank you for sharing that. And I will make sure to include the link to your book on Amazon. There were anyone who would be interested in learning more and adopting the technique, that they will have the ability. Saleem, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been a great pleasure, and I hope we will be able to have you again on the show soon.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Dana. And yes, we're absolutely happy to speak with you and others that you invite on your show as well. Thanks for making time and space for me.